America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
One of the things we talk about so often here on Point of View is how faith-based organizations are making a difference, whether it's in the community, whether it's in prisons, whether it's in drug rehabilitation, all sorts of different ways in which faith communities are making a difference. Frankly, we've oftentimes come to the conclusion that they actually are doing a better job in some respects than even some of the government programs, because they include the whole person in the conversation. So I thought this would be a very good reason to talk about this new book. Came out earlier this month, Heaven Help Us, How Faith Communities Inspire Hope, Strengthen Neighborhoods, and Build the Future. 15 chapters in this book. We'll pick out about a handful of those that I thought were of interest, but you are welcome to ask other questions. It is written by the former governor of the state of Ohio, John Kasich, and he is an individual that has, of course, served in Congress, has served as governor. He also ran for the presidency in 2016. Today he runs the Kasich Company and is best known for many of his best-selling books. Courage is Contagious, Two Paths, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It's Up to Us. And, of course, this book we'll talk about today, Heaven Help Us, which has just come out. And you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. But if not, we have a link so that you can get it in hardback and on Kindle. So, Governor, thank you so much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Let's we can talk about your first book. Came out in your introduction 25 years ago. Courage is Contagious. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things to change the face of America. That was, of course, the bestseller. But then later on in your introduction, you say, in some respects, Heaven Help Us closes the circle of what you set out to do in that first book. And then you said, actually, it doesn't so much close it as it opens it up. But this is really your desire to point out that these faith communities are having a very profound impact, and one of the reasons you've written so much about them.
Well, Kerby, this is actually my second faith book. My first one was called Every Other Monday, and it's a story that traces a Bible study that got started, I helped start in 1987, and it still goes on today. But this book is sort of like the first one, except what I realized is that our faith institutions offer sort of a clubhouse for people to take their great ideas on providing some healing in our country, whether it's human trafficking or poverty or homelessness or whatever it may be. And because you're now in a place where you can have material support, psychological support, more people helping you, it's easier to transform things in that setting than it is if you're trying to do it all by yourself. And that's why I insisted that it be a celebration, not just of the works, but also of the institutions that can help you to achieve your goals.
You know, one of the individuals we've had on this program in the past when he was alive, of course he's passed on now, was Rodney Stark, professor at Baylor University. And he and some others have actually tried to run some numbers, some calculations on the benefits that come to the communities, to society, really to government as large, because when governments are trying to do something, of course, they're hamstringed in a variety of different ways, but faith-based communities that are doing soup kitchens, they're doing counseling programs, they're having an outreach to the homeless. I mean, he calculated the net benefit to the government and to society at large in the billions of dollars, and I think most people have forgotten about that, and that's why I was so excited about your book.
Well, Kerby, that's, the other thing that's interesting is when people approach government, whether it's adoption, whether it is literacy, it doesn't matter, any host of things, or schools for that matter. If the faith community wants to show their faith, not by what they say, but what they do, it's amazing how you can get government to be open to the fact that they need help. And in the process of that, of course, you bring about significant change. And at the same time, people are living their faith. And we can get the government to understand that the faith community is, somehow not an obstacle or an enemy to them. And it's been pretty interesting for me to see how that works. And, the prison ministry, you mentioned it in the intro. When I ran the state, we had a very robust prison ministry, and we also taught skills. And we had one of the lowest recidivism rates, in the country. You give people skills, you give them hope, you give them something to cling to, and it can work out. And so you're exactly right.
And again, we've talked about some of the prison ministries and all that. I thought we might begin, and you even end, with a shooting. And the first chapter, which again, I might just mention, Governor, we have quite a number of listeners in places like South Carolina, but whether you lived in South Carolina or not, you probably remember the story of this 21-year-old individual attended a Bible study at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Of course, we don't mention the individual's name. You don't either. And the sad commentary of that was, I think, very powerful, because you title that first chapter Forgiveness, and you really tell us a very important story that we need to learn.
Well, you are exactly right, Kerby. It's a well-known story. And, some people said, well, why do you need to include it? Because it's an amazing story about forgiveness. And, where 9 people were murdered in a Bible study, and during the arraignment, they all went and said, we forgive the shooter, which is astounding. And it traces this whole process of forgiveness from the beginning to what happens when more time passes and how do you feel. But I like the area of forgiveness, because we all need it in one way or another. We need people to forgive us. We need to forgive others. And you think about families that have been torn apart over stupid little things, right? It can happen. And I've experienced some of it myself. And the idea that you can say, I'm sorry, or I forgive you. One of my friends, he had a brother that really took care of their father and did all the hard work, and they were not speaking. And I told my friend Barney, I said, Barney, call up your brother and tell him that you're sorry you didn't do more and that you hope he'll forgive you. He said it's just restored the whole relationship. So forgiveness was really, really important, and I'm glad I put that chapter in there, and there's a lot we can learn about it.
I might just mention that so often we've talked about the importance of forgiveness. We've had Max Lucado in studio a couple of times, and one of his books was on this issue of forgiveness. But this very powerful story is one. By the end, the 15th chapter is on remembrance. It has to do with another shooting. But while we're talking about forgiveness, I think the one out of Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church is one, but also the one with the Amish, that shooting that took place there is just another example, Governor, of the power of forgiveness, and really the need for us to maybe use those as role models for our children and grandchildren.
Yes, there's no question about it. And forgiveness is hard, but I went through it myself when it involved a man who was a drunk driver who killed my mother and father. And for a while, I didn't have any forgiveness in me. And then I realized, well, wait a minute. And different than South Carolina, I came to the conclusion if the guy could turn the clock back, he would. And so I was able to kind of move beyond it. And I was actually able to tell that story to some people who had come in to see me, who's somebody who was on death row, who I delayed the execution. They came in really angry, and they left. They understood where I was coming from.
We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
When I first heard about the survey, I doubted its credibility. That's what most people might conclude when you hear that half of left-leaning Americans say that assassinating Donald Trump would be justified. It turns out the survey was conducted by NCRI and Rutgers University Social Perception Lab. It had the chilling title, Assassination Culture: How Burning Teslas and Killing Billionaires Became a Meme Aesthetic for Political Violence. The data included in the report is based on responses collected from 1,200 U.S. adults. The research has concluded that a broader assassination culture appears to be emerging within segments of the U.S. public on the extreme left. They come to the conclusions based on these survey results. A majority of left-leaning respondents believe that murdering Trump was at least partially justified. A near majority believed murdering Elon Musk somewhat justified, and a majority thought destroying Tesla dealerships was at least partially acceptable. Recently on my radio program, we talked about how Luigi Mangione had become a cult hero because he murdered United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson. He has become an illustration of this assassination culture. One of my guests talked about how you can buy devotional candles bearing his image, along with a coffee mug, a T-shirt, and a necklace. You know, on the first day of Passover, the Pennsylvania governor and his family were put in danger when an arsonist set fire to the governor's residence. Governor Shapiro forcefully spoke out against the violence. He lamented that it was becoming all too common in our society and had to stop. I agree and suggest he begin by talking to some of the left-leaning people in his own political party. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view on big data, go to viewpoints.info/data. That's viewpoints.info/data. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today John Kasich, and again, the book is entitled Heaven Help Us, How Faith Communities Inspire Hope, Strengthen Neighborhoods, and Build the Future. And Governor, one of the chapters I did want to jump to is about the convoy of hope. You call it the Horse Whisperer. But one of the reasons why I wanted to bring it up is every year when I drive to speak at Kennecott, and I do stuff at the Kennecott Institute, I drive right by in Springfield, Missouri, the Convoy of Hope. It's an enormous organization. I'm sorry to say we have not done an interview with them, although I think your book has inspired me to do so. And you've got a whole chapter about an organization that people should know about, just like they know Samaritan's Purse and a variety of others. Can you tell us more?
Well, Kerby, it's so amazing. It's one of the problems with the book is when people read about this, they say, I'm not capable of doing what Hal Donaldson did. He grew up in a very dire circumstance, decided he wanted to go to college and make something of himself, and he did. And he became a ghostwriter. He met Mother Teresa, and she said to him, "What are you doing to change the world?" He flew home after meeting her, called his buddies, and they drove around in a pickup truck with a couple bags of groceries and gave this food out to people. Today, he's feeding over 500,000 people every single day. He goes to many of the places where, storms or tragedies have hit, and he works with local churches to try to bring not just temporary but permanent relief. And it's just a remarkable story. It is number 32, I think, on the list of charities. And Hal Donaldson is just a remarkable man, and I would encourage you to have him because he's extremely humble. He's an incredible calling, and Kerby, it's a story that is just hard to believe.
Let's give some of the numbers because, at least in your book, you talk about 571,000 children worldwide are fed each day. Of course, right now, we've tried occasionally to focus on some of the outreach into places like Ukraine and a variety of other places, have served more than 250 million people. And again, maybe you get back to the old, maybe it's one of the best kept secrets in the humanitarian area because I've been very impressed by, as I've learned more about about it, and then I was even more encouraged to see what we could do to give it some visibility here on radio, simply because you wrote about it in your book.
Well, I'm delighted for that, but let me tell you something. You've got to get Hal on here, and I've been with him, I don't know, 2 or 3 times, and he's invited me to go to Central America to see some of what he's doing there.
Yes.
When you think about it, it's hard to believe that he went from a bag of groceries in the back of a pickup
yes.
to what he's able to achieve today. And listen, he's getting more and more well known. He's had presidents go over there and talk to people who are involved in it. But he relies on local churches. He will not go somewhere to solve a problem if he doesn't have some church there that can carry on the work that he's trying to do. It's really remarkable.
Well, again, that chapter is entitled The Hope Whisperer. It's all about Hal, and we'll see if we can get him on, and my producers listen to it, so I'm sure that will happen. Let me maybe get into the fact that most of the focus of what we do here at Point of View is Christian, but there have been some very good interfaith kinds of outreaches. So one of your chapters talks about what's happening in Omaha, Nebraska.
Isn't that amazing, Kerby? Amazing story, isn't it? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, finish the story. I'll let you finish the story because you obviously have enthusiasm about that, and I just thought it's one that I've never really heard about before until I read your book.
Well, there is a gentleman who he basically had a dream, and he was in a position where he couldn't let go of the dream. I don't know, Kerby, whether you've had a dream and you've written it down and try to remember it. Well, he did, and he kept writing and writing and remembering. And he went to his congregation, and he talked to them about this dream he had, Bob Freeman, and he was one of the leaders in the congregation, doesn't consider himself to be particularly religious, but he kept pursuing this, and his idea was to get a plot of land and locate a church, a synagogue, and a mosque on the same piece of property with a community center where there could be interfaith discussions and inspiration. It took him 15 years. And what was interesting is when he first came up with the idea, he was able to get a mosque to participate. His biggest problem was getting a Christian church to participate, but he ultimately found one, and now they are located in Omaha. And it's funny, I was on a train the other day, headed from New York to Washington, and there was a woman on the train from Omaha, and I asked her if she knew about this place, this interfaith operation. She didn't, because she doesn't really live in Omaha anymore, but she texted her parents, and they said, oh, we know exactly where it is. It's fantastic. So that's a dream come true, 15 years, and a remarkable story.
Well, again, and we're talking about the fact that you basically have all 3 of those, a synagogue, a mosque, and a church. And if I remember right, I think this was all finished just about the time during the pandemic. And that itself is a story, is it not?
Well, I think what is also interesting is there was a time here, of course, where Muslims were under great attack. And that was a synagogue that really stood up, the rabbi did, to try to protect, and it's sort of like the story at the very end of the book,
yes.
Which is the murder that occurred in the synagogue.
Right.
And it was the Muslim community that really did GoFundMe. They supported, they were involved in many different ways. So while we may have our disagreements, with some of the strands of the Abrahamic religion, I kind of think God's big enough to kind of take care of stuff, Kerby. That's the way I look at it. And so I wanted to celebrate all of them. And my publisher is Zondervan, a Christian publishing house, and they wanted me to be inclusive, which is exactly what I've done and wanted to do. And the rest of it is the story. Very cool. By the way, I found out about this through Susie Buffett, who is the daughter of Warren Buffett.
Yes.
At a U2 conference. I had worked with Bob and Bobby Shriver, a guy who accompanied him through all he was doing to provide debt relief in Africa for the poorest countries, which then led to PEPFAR, and the vaccination and the medicine provided and saved the lives of millions of people there. It was an amazing story. That's where I met Susie. She directed me to Bob Freeman, and the rest is in this book.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting because Warren Buffett, Susie Buffett, Bob Freeman dream, then trying to pull all that together, and then it really just kind of gets completed during the pandemic. I think it was August 2020, and then some of that opportunity. And again, I think I need to add a disclaimer, and that is there are times when I will join hands with individuals with whom I disagree theologically, maybe even politically, but if we can have a common goal, whether it's in the pro-life community, whether it's a pro-family initiative, whether it's reaching out to the homeless, whether it's a drug program that is going to help people get off of drugs, whatever it might be, I don't have to compromise my theology. As a matter of fact, I see that sometimes as a great witnessing opportunity, quite frankly, when we can work together. And sometimes interfaith ideas have been condemned because we're supposedly compromising our faith. I think those of us that have our strong faith can go into those relationships knowing full well that we might have a great influence for the community and might at the same time share what our particular religious perspective might be with others, and do that in a way that I think is beneficial both to the individuals and to society, don't you think?
Yeah, and a good conversation. And I kind of look at the faith issue being really two things: love God, which creates humility; love your neighbor. And the great religions believe that. And I think any ability to communicate and discuss where we all are is a positive. And I think the Lord likes that.
Let me just mention we are going to a break, and there are some great resources you can find out about Heaven Help Us, how faith communities inspire hope, strengthen neighborhoods, and build the future. And you can find all of that at the website at pointofview.net. We also have our Take Action item today about the SAVE Act, and that is available to you. We've been talking about that. We sent an email to you yesterday about that. So if you haven't taken the time to click on that button that says Take Action, we give you an opportunity to contact your member of Congress about that particular issue. Actually, it's two members because it is going to your two senators. And if you'd like to see my commentary today, we'll get into some of that in the second hour. So lots of great material available on the website at pointofview.net. If you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know a little bit more, I'd like to maybe read one of those stories, maybe use this to encourage people in their community to make a difference, I think you would certainly benefit from that. And so we have information about that on our website at pointofview.net. We also, of course, have a link to the Kasich company.com, and you can get some information about him and information about the book. It's all available there at the website. Come back, we're going to talk about some other particular partnerships and even radical hospitality. We're certainly going to end by a real comment about remembrance. All that coming up right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again as we talk about the book Heaven Help Us, How Faith Communities Inspire Hope, Strengthen Neighborhoods, and Build the Future. John Kasich is with us as we are talking about his book. And again, you can find it in your local bookstore, but we have information about it if you'd like to get it in hardback or Kindle. And Governor, I thought it might be good to bring together a lot of different pieces because we oftentimes, first of all, talk about the power of Christian films and films that are documentaries and the rest. We've also had this filmmaker, Tony Kritz, on the program to talk about the book, Read How God's People Can Bring Justice Through Literacy, and also have talked about the documentary Sentenced. And, of course, it is narrated by NBA champion. Matter of fact, right now we're watching him in the playoffs, Stephen Curry. So this one is what you call the power of partnership.
Exactly. Kerby, the way it worked was Tony just decided that the school operation needed to be cleaned up, and he and his pals from his church and some other churches went and just cleaned up the playground and the school.
Mm-hmm.
And process of this, he wanted to do something that he thought would last a lot longer, so he started this literacy program. And he's a man on fire, as you know. He's spreading this literacy program all across the country, and I'm glad you've had him on, but how cool is it that he got Steph Curry hitting another three for him in this movie that they have, and it's really a terrific thing. And when we think about, okay, we can't be Hal Donaldson, so we can't feed 500,000 people a day. Well, maybe we can teach a kid how to read, because when kids can't read, they end up in poverty. And Tony maintains that 25% of all people grow up not being able to read by the time they become adults, which is astounding if it's true. I hope it's a little bit exaggerated, but he claims that those are the numbers. So there's no reason for me to really doubt them. But teach a kid to read. My wife has a little mission, Kerby, and I call it a mission. She doesn't think of it that way. She has a thing where she visits what she calls her olds. These are people who are elderly, and she just checks in on them every couple of weeks. They have great joy with her stopping by. She gets great joy from spending time with them. And, that's something simple that everybody can do. Think of if every member of every church had one old that they were connected to, because loneliness, as you know, is one of the great epidemics in America today. So it's a simple thing we can do and profound, just like Tony's work on literacy.
Well, again, I was just thinking about how churches can think about this. First of all, you have probably in your community people that don't speak English well, so you could have an ESL.
Right.
That would be English as a second language program. I know many churches that have that. I know when I was growing up, I volunteered to do tutoring. It wasn't so much in English as it was in mathematics, but again, doing that inner city was very significant, not only to the impact that we were having on those individuals so that they might be able to graduate from high school rather than go out into the streets, but also the impact it had on me. And in some respects, there's a great story of an individual in Oregon, not exactly the foundational place for a lot of places to develop, who nevertheless puts together a book, puts together a film, and gets a notable NBA author, champion, and shooter to actually participate in that regard. And so it really does sometimes show what I would call the power of one. And sometimes if you can't do it individually, then not ask what can I do, but what can we do? I think we have a great deal to benefit from that, and that's why you've entitled that particular chapter, The Power of Partnership.
Exactly. There's one other one, Kerby, because I don't know how much time we'll have that I want to tell you about. And there is a lady who lives in Long Island who has a son, and a lot of people will relate to this. Her son is autistic.
Yes. Okay.
And she is worried about what is going to happen to him when he ages out and they age out. And so she works with her churches and a variety of churches, and she now has created several group homes in Long Island. Now, here in Central Ohio, where I live, there's a woman here who she has an autistic son, and one of her great worries is what's going to happen with him and where is he going to live. It was funny because I was doing an interview with CBN the other day, and the man who was managing the sound for us, he lives in Central Ohio as well.
Mm-hmm.
And what I told this woman, I said, listen, there is a way for you either to talk to your church, or maybe you should go to church and you can talk to the minister about your great fears about what happens to your son. And perhaps there can be a group home that could be started right here, because we need them all across the country. And the guy running the sound for CBM says, I live here too. If you would introduce me to her, I'd like to work with her to see if we can get something going on that front. Isn't that something?
It is. And again, that, if I remember right, isn't that from a Greek Orthodox congregation that she's part
Exactly.
of? Yes.
Correct.
Well, since you mentioned Ohio, let's talk about one that you've known for some time, the founder of Cardinal Health, which is a global health care service, which is headquartered right there in the state in which you were governor, Ohio.
Yeah, this is a story about a guy by the name of Bob Walter who founded it, and he's done very, very well. He's very, very successful. But I have to tell you, Kerby, he's an interesting guy because he's, I would say he's a little bit flinty and sometimes a little bit difficult. He and I have known each other for a long, long time, but I've come to find out that his generosity really has no bounds. And he was introduced to a priest up in one of the really torn up towns in Massachusetts, and started to support this gentleman who was trying to save the town. You know, the textile industry was gone. It was different groups of people, different demographics moving in. And this guy, Paul O'Brien, really a really interesting guy and a good guy and a very forceful guy, started a program to feed people in the community. And he's got a new school coming up. He's doing all kinds of amazing things. But one of the things he did is he raised money so that people, when they're hungry, can go into his operation. They have tablecloths and nice settings. They have a waiter who will seat you, and you come in. You don't pay anything. Nobody asks any questions, and you're welcome. And he's transforming that whole community through feeding people, and at the same time building an even bigger school that can bring such harmony and peace and love to the people in the community.
Just an incredible story. And again, so that involves Father O'Brien as well as, of course, Bob Walter, and just, story after story. But let's maybe pick out one other one that before we take our break, and that is we oftentimes, governors, spend some time talking about what's wrong with and some of the concerns about the foster care system. And so there's a chapter there about radical hospitality and really talking about adoption and foster care and what we can do in a community. Sometimes the argument is, well, it's so broken and the government's running it, there's nothing we as individuals can do. And you really have a different aspect of that you tell in that story in one of the chapters.
Well, they actually, the federal government actually has welcomed in the faith community in helping to fix the foster system, to bring some joy. Look, I've got some notes here, 31,000 volunteers who are mobilized. There have been 98 makeovers of Department of Human Services visitation rooms in Oregon. Ben Sands, who I had been working with, just contacted me. I urged him to go to Kentucky because these foster care programs are all under review. He is down there now. He emailed me the other day saying it's working. Listen to this, 919 hours of respite provided through Foster Parents Night Out. And these people started all this in Oregon, and here's the funny thing, Kerby, you mentioned the other day, maybe not the center of all this, but when you look at it, you got Juliana Goebel and Ben Sand, and you got your friend Tony Chris. They're all operating out of Portland. So maybe God's alive and well there in Portland, you know?
It's a good line. Again, I only use that because having a wife from there and having traveled there once a year at least to teach, when I go to Vermont, that's, I think, now the least religious church, religious state, and I think Oregon used to be the least religious, now second least religious, and yet here we can see some faith-based organizations out of that. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about, again, how some of these faith communities can help in the midst of tragedy. In one case, a hurricane. In another case, a shooting. And I think you will benefit from that. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to read the rest of these stories, because you're only covering part of the 15 that are there, Heaven Help Us is the title of the book, How Faith Communities Inspire Hope, Strengthen Neighborhoods, and Build the Future. And if you'd like to know a little bit more, of course, we have all the links necessary on the website at pointofview.net. And so if you'd like to know a little bit more about the book or about John Kasich or his organization or anything else, just take the time to click on there. We'll come back with a couple other stories as we wind down this first hour right after these important messages.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we continue our conversation about the book, Heaven Help Us. Governor John Kasich with us, and thought we would pull together one story from early in your book, one that you end your book with, because it gets into how these faith communities respond to a crisis. The first one has to do with Naples, Florida. You've gone to St. John's Episcopal Church there in Naples, but going back to basically September 2022, you had a Category 4 storm surge, and that was from Hurricane Ian, and down even a little bit further, you also had a Category 4 storm that actually had hit Hurricane Irma. And so the crisis that strikes, in this case, Florida, with these occasional hurricanes, is certainly devastating, but also has become, Governor, an opportunity for ministry, hasn't it?
Well, yes. My wife and I were occasionally visiting Naples, and we found this church, St. John's Episcopal Church, and we were going to it. And one Sunday we went, after we'd been gone a long time, and we went in to try to get to the inside the sacristy of the church, and everything was locked up. And then they said they directed us out onto a patio, and they had moved the church services. By the way, the entire church had been flooded. And here's the irony thing. On the altar, there were fish that had kind of washed up onto the altar, believe it or not. Is that ironic, Kerby? And
Wow.
anyway, they were figuring out how they were going to have to rebuild the church, but at the same time, they had a lot of mission partners, people who provided shoes for kids that didn't have shoes, things like that. And they raised $200,000 to give to their mission partners, never took a break, and now, because of the efforts they've made, all these groups match the kind of money that St. John's Episcopal raises, and this thing's just taken off like crazy. I was there on Easter Sunday in the morning, and the pastor, Joe Miyoko, actually had a copy of Heaven Help Us, and I was flabbergasted, but he held it up and talked about it, included it in part of his sermon. So it's a really great story and a really great church, and I'm glad that I found it, plain and simple. So they took care of themselves. At the same time, they took care of others.
And a good illustration of that is that sometimes we look to the government for solutions, and certainly the government can really provide those when things are just so devastated. But it has been striking to me, whether you look at Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, whether you look at the fires that were in Southern California, whatever tragedy you might want to pick, it has been amazing and encouraging to see how many times faith-based organizations have actually stepped in and made a difference. And this is why when sometimes you see this sort of resident hostility to and residual hostility towards religious ideas from people in government or from secularists, they fail to understand the kind of positive impact that they're having. And I think that's why I'm very encouraged by your book. But let's, if we can, wind down, because you began.
Partnership. One other thing, Kirk.
Go for it.
That is a partnership between the faith organizations and the government is truly effective because, in these storm hit areas, FEMA plays a major role. And so I think a partnership is what works really well. And for, everybody to kind of collaborate, because it's the people we're trying to help. And that's what it's all about.
Well, and I think of, Edmund Burke used to talk about the little platoons that were part of our society. In some respects, churches and faith-based organizations are kind of those little platoons. But just in the interest of time, let's get to the last one. You began, of course, we talked about the forgiveness story that we talked about through AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Now you end with a chapter dealing with the horrific shooting in the Pittsburgh synagogue, which took place October 27th, 2018. And in some respects, you've started with a conversation about forgiveness. This one really is a discussion about remembrance. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, they decided that they were going to keep everything that was connected to that horrible day, and the outpouring of support that came from communities all over the world. And everything, I I've been in that museum. I've looked at the kind of artwork that was sent to them by children across the world. And I mean, you see this stuff, it's so emotional. You can't help but have a good cry about how the world came to regard that tragedy and somehow to relate that tragedy to themselves, and what it is that they felt such deep grief for the people who had experienced it, but maybe in some respects realized something like that could potentially affect all of them. And so there was a great outpouring of an institution, faith in God, and people across the globe, again, responded to it. And it's an amazing story, Kerby. I want to tell you that this is my 6th book that I've written, and somehow I feel like the wind is under my wings. You know, it's just lifting me to try to do something good. And to put this book out there has just been a total joy. And being able to talk as a Christian about the love of Christ and our ability to collaborate with others who have love for God it's just been great. And I'm going to keep going with this thing, and hopefully it is a message that can get people inspired to do something that they're capable of doing, because we all have certain gifts. There are expectations for all of us, and we are capable of doing amazing things with the power of God and with the idea that we have a purpose. And that's what Heaven Help Us is all about.
Well, again, you've done a great job. And closing thoughts about the exclamation point that punctuates our faith. And again, as I've said so often, Governor, sometimes people say, what can I do? And I said, first of all, I think you read through the book and see the power of one. But sometimes you might say, okay, there's not much I can do, but you can maybe change the pronoun. What can we do? When we gather together, we exercise our faith, we can really make a difference. And that's really what the book Heaven Help Us is all about. So I appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View.
I loved it. Kerby, thank you so much, and good luck, and God bless your mission.
We'll take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get into some issues in the news. But let me just mention again that there's information about the book on the website, pointofview.net. We do have a take action item. We mentioned it last week, but let me mention it again. This is a piece of legislation that has already passed the House of Representatives. The SAVE Act stands for Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. Stipulates that each state must create procedures to ensure that citizens that are there and voting actually are citizens. And there is a much more flexibility than sometimes the critics have said. As a matter of fact, we may even get the author of this particular piece of legislation on the program. But it has already passed the House, and so now it's in the United States Senate. And if you are convinced that we should have individuals voting who are citizens, most recent survey showed 83% of Americans support the proof of citizenship requirements when registering to vote, then I think you would certainly want to send this particular letter on to your 2 senators. We have given you a sample letter. You can modify it any way you would like, and then you will have to fill out the contact information if you haven't done that recently, because we've changed organizations that may facilitate this. But once you do so, then there's an opportunity for you then to either send it or print it out and mail it or even preview it, and all of that is available at the website pointofview.net. I did send out an email about that the other day, so if you've responded, great. If you have not, I would encourage you as we go to a break to exercise your civic duty, especially about one of the most important issues about who should be allowed to vote in the next election. We're going to get into some of the issues in the news. We'll cover that right after this.
In 19th century London, 2 towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I really appreciate your program. I don't get to listen to it every day because I have to work, but it's really a blessing to me and to all of us.
Everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
I just appreciate all you guys do. I mean, I learned so much, and it's amazing what you teach that I say to other people, and they look at me like, where did you hear that? So I appreciate you guys. So thank you for all you do.
I just turned your program on, and I want to just let you know how much I appreciate just getting the truth out.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, if you would like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Going to spend just a little bit of time, not a whole lot, talking about this Supreme Court decision that has halted the deportation flights, and maybe just dig into a little bit of the reasoning behind it. Then I might just postpone the rest of that conversation till Friday, because we'll have two lawyers from First Liberty Institute. Maybe they can dig through some of that and help answer that question as well. While I'm talking about the rest of the week, I would encourage you to be listening tomorrow. First hour, going to be talking about the fact that, you know, when your kids graduate from high school, they don't have to graduate from God. And what can we do to prepare them for whatever they're going to encounter? If they're going to college, what is some of the particular challenges they're going to face there? If they're going to go into the workforce, what would maybe be some of the issues to address there? If they're going to go in the military, so we'll talk about the fact that you don't need to graduate from God when you graduate from high school and head off to whatever God might have for you. On Thursday, we have Lathan Watts with us. We'll be talking about their Supreme Court case and a number of other religious liberty cases. And of course, you've already heard me mention that on Friday, we'll have Jeff Mateer and Keisha Russell. And I think we will certainly benefit from some of the legal minds that'll be with us on Thursday and Friday. Let's get into this one. Matt Vespa talks about the fact that maybe this is why the Supreme Court has halted the Tren de Aragua deportation flights. And he points out that over the weekend, I would have talked about it yesterday because we had our Millennial Roundtable, so here it is Tuesday, talking about the Supreme Court over the weekend in a 7-2 decision. You might wonder who were the two dissenting justices. Well, that would be Justice Samuel Alito and Justice Clarence Thomas. But 7-2 halted the deportation flights. And again, this is a question that people have had. Why did they do so? Now, at issue is this. The initial ruling was that the president has the authority to invoke the Alien Enemies Act to deport these illegal alien terrorists. One of the big questions was a particular piece of legislation that was passed long ago. Can it be used now? And the Supreme Court seems to have agreed with that interpretation because, if nothing else, the Constitution was written, a long time ago, and certainly that is still supposedly relevant today. So that was the issue. But then the question in this particular case had to do with those in the state of Texas. This would be individuals in Texas that were members of Tren de Aragua, which is different than, but maybe similar to. You can talk about the differences or the similarities with MS-13, but nevertheless, the argument was that this group in Texas, who are supposed to be shipped out, were not given enough options to challenge this. Now, there are all sorts of people that have weighed in, but let me quote from a man by the name of Ed Whalen. We've quoted him before. I noticed that his Twitter post says Ed Whalen CPPC, which means Ethics and Public Policy Center. That's where I know him from, but this article refers to him as Ed Whalen at National Review. So you can take it for whatever it is worth, but he is kind of a legal scholar. And he posted the other day on X, formerly known as Twitter, the only explanation I can see for the Supreme Court's extraordinary 7-2 order that directs the administration not to remove any member of these putative class of detainees from the United States until further order from the court is that the court does not trust Trump. Okay, so if that is the case, that's maybe the answer to that question. But there have been others that have raised some very important questions. Let me again quote from another post from Emma Jo Morris, who said, "It's ridiculous that no due process shenanigans were brought up when Joe Biden was importing criminal illegal aliens. But now that they're being deported and Democrats are crying, we must go through them on a case-by-case basis." Let me talk about that philosophically and then practically. Philosophically, it is, I think, a relevant question. You have so often heard individuals complain that we aren't actually vetting each one of these individuals before they go. But that's coming from individuals who turned, I think it's fair to say, a blind eye towards the lack of vetting of anybody that was imported into this country. So as Emma Jo Morris says, nobody was bringing up this question about, have these people been properly vetted before they were brought in to this country or allowed to go into this country? Were they vetted before they were put on buses and shipped across the country? Were any of them vetted because when they were snuck into some of these airports without anybody's notice? And of course, you know the answer there. And so in some respects, just as I've said to individuals who are now upset that we're not properly vetting each one of those individuals being deported, where were you when we weren't vetting any of those individuals coming in? And now if I could take that for individuals and now apply it to the Supreme Court, where were you in the Supreme Court when you saw massive influxes of individuals into this country and never issued even a stay or an injunction or an opinion about that at all? You sort of lose a little bit of your credibility, though I still have high respect for the high court, when you now all of a sudden discover that, well, these individuals need their 14th Amendment rights. I'm not sure that they do, because that now gets to the practicality. Do individuals who are here illegally have the same 14th Amendment rights as individuals who are citizens and are here legally? And more importantly, to the practical aspect, if we have to go through a case-by-case basis, recognizing that we have probably more than 20 million people that have been let in, either in the Biden administration or previous administrations, if we go through a case-by-case basis, they're never going to leave. I think we know that as well. So again, one of the other questions that has been asked is, where was your concern before? Ed Doherty puts it this way: do you know how many stories I could tell of children who were trafficked across the border and assaulted, he uses a different word, because of the policies of Joe Biden? There aren't enough volumes that could fit into a library. And then Stephen Miller on the Trump staff says, we live in a society where foreign alien terrorists have unlimited free legal representation, but Americans whose communities have been stolen from them are left without recourse. He says we are rebalancing the scales. Well, you can read all of this. This goes on for quite a bit, but it shows you some of the posts and some of the guess as to why the Supreme Court over the weekend basically halted the deportation flights, at least in this particular case. And we'll see where that plays out in the next few days and weeks. But nevertheless, I wanted you to have at least some explanation for that, because you probably heard the news and thought, well, is that the end of deportation of individuals? I don't think so, but you can see that the 7-2 decision is of some concern by those who felt that it was time to remove the worst first, and now it's even hard to remove some of the worst first. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
When I first heard about the survey, I doubted its credibility. That's what most people might conclude when you hear that half of left-leaning Americans say that assassinating Donald Trump would be justified. It turns out the survey was conducted by NCRI and Rutgers University Social Perception Lab. It had the chilling title, Assassination Culture: How Burning Teslas and Killing Billionaires Became a Meme Aesthetic for Political Violence. The data included in the report is based on responses collected from 1,200 U.S. adults. The researchers concluded that a broader assassination culture appears to be emerging within segments of the U.S. public on the extreme left. They come to the conclusions based on these survey results. A majority of left-leaning respondents believe that murdering Trump was at least partially justified. A near majority believed murdering Elon Musk somewhat justified, and a majority thought destroying Tesla dealerships was at least partially acceptable. Recently on my radio program, we talked about how Luigi Mangione had become a cult hero because he murdered United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson. He has become an illustration of this assassination culture. One of my guests talked about how you can buy devotional candles bearing his image, along with a coffee mug, a T-shirt, and a necklace. You know, on the first day of Passover, the Pennsylvania governor and his family were put in danger when an arsonist set fire to the governor's residence. Governor Shapiro forcefully spoke out against the violence. He lamented that it was becoming all too common in our society and had to stop. I agree and suggest he begin by talking to some of the left-leaning people in his own political party. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view on big data, go to viewpoints.info/data. That's viewpoints.info/data. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's, if we can, talk about Harvard University. That's kind of become the issue of the day in terms of higher education. And if you're not familiar, of course, Harvard has said, even though the Trump administration has implemented various kinds of executive orders and actually called for various kinds of actions, and even though the Supreme Court has ruled against Harvard University in terms of their admission process, the argument coming back from Harvard University is we will not comply. The Harvard president put it this way. He said, no government, regardless of which party is in power, should decide what private universities can teach, whom they can admit and hire, in which areas of study and inquiry they can pursue. In some respects, I agree with that. We believe in free speech, and you are free to do whatever you want. But that also gets into whether or not you are free to discriminate against individuals, which is then a different issue, and whether or not you should receive federal funds to do some things which are going against the standard policies of the government. So you can kind of see where we put ourselves. Before I get into the specifics, because one of the big questions is, can the government, we're looking primarily at the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, revoke the tax-exempt status of Harvard? So that is our next article. It is written by an eminent professor of law. University of California at Berkeley, John Wu, in which he says Trump could have a strong case to revoke Harvard's tax-exempt status. I won't get into the legal issues yet, other than just simply to say that there is also the question about federal funding, given the fact that the endowment for Harvard University, and I've looked it up, is $50.7 billion with a B. But I think there's a bigger and broader question I thought we'd look at first, and that comes from our friend Victor Davis Hanson, who's been on the program with us before, because he asks a very good question. Do elite universities really wish to fight the federal government? And he goes on for quite a number of pages. As a matter of fact, I'm going to give you a good portion of the 5 pages that he goes into, because he's looking at it from a broader perspective than just Harvard University, although the issue of Harvard University, federal funding of Harvard University, and the tax-exempt status of Harvard University are, if you will, the particular coat hanger that he hangs all of this on. But he points out, first of all, that, of course, Harvard has refused to accept the orders from the Trump administration and concerning the chronic problems with, and it's a long list, anti-Semitism, campus violence, what he calls racial tribalism, bias, and segregation. That's a pretty long list, but let's get into it. He says, yet unlike some conservative campuses that distrust an overbearing Washington, Harvard and most elite schools, he's thinking Harvard, Yale, Princeton, University of Pennsylvania, Brown, on and on and on, want to have it both ways. They do as they please on their own turf, and yet still demand that the taxpayers send them multi-billion-dollar checks in addition to the multi-billion-dollar private incomes. And he says, aside from the issues of autonomy and free expression, there are lots of campus practices that higher education would prefer were not known to the general public. So here, because Victor Davis Hanson is at the Hoover Institute, which is at Stanford University, because he's been a university professor in the California system, he really now kind of pulls back the curtain and helps you, the taxpayers, understand what is going on. Because he says, I love this illustration, envision elite private colleges as mossy rocks that seem outwardly picturesque until you turn them over and see what crawls beneath. Kind of a good word picture indeed. He says, so if there are protracted standoffs, our elite campuses will be hard-pressed to defend the indefensible. This effort will be difficult because public confidence in higher education has already plummeted to historic lows in the most recent polls. That's where he gives you some of the recent surveys. In some of the surveys, you have, interestingly enough, 30% of Americans who either give little confidence or no confidence to higher education, 30%. Then you have 40% that give some confidence. So that means, if you add those two up, 70%, 7 out of 10, either give no confidence, little confidence, or some confidence of higher education. Okay, that shows that less than a third of Americans have anything like confidence in college campuses. Now he goes through his list. He says over the past half century, tuition has generally risen at twice the rate of inflation. In part, that price gouging, he says, became standard because federal aid to our most prestigious schools has skyrocketed hand in glove with the federalized student loan program. We'll go back to Barack Obama, which instituted that. It has become a $1.7 trillion entity in which the combined rate of both those students who defaulted on their guaranteed loans and are currently late on their payments is nearing 12 to 13%. In sum, he says, colleges counted on the insured stream of tuition money and so raised their prices inordinately given federal guarantees. He then goes on to say, note that small private Hillsdale College, which takes no federal money and is a guarantor of its own generous student aid, charges about $45,000 to $50,000 for combined tuition, room, and board, about half of the going rate in the Ivy League and similar elite campuses. He then goes on to say that half of the youth in the country who choose to go straight to work and not attend college might object to being having their tax dollars used in this way. They would assume that universities with multi-billion-dollar endowments, I just gave you Harvard's endowment a moment ago, and huge annual incomes have plenty of resources to guarantee their own student loans. That way, campuses would have the financial interest in seeing their own students graduate in 4 years, get jobs, and pay back their alma mater promptly and fully. There's the point. When the government guarantees that, there's no incentive for the government for the colleges to say, maybe this particular major that you're in, or maybe your inability to graduate in 4 years is going to harm your ability to pay us back. He says there's also, this is another concern, no intellectual diversity on campus. Some recent studies have found the ratio of Democrat and liberal professors to their Republican conservative counterparts to be 10-1, and especially in the social sciences and humanities. He says there are plenty of conservative PhDs on the market, but higher education has used insidious methods such as diversity oaths and covert political bias to find ways not to hire or retain them. Then, of course, we get to the legal issues. The Supreme Court, in a recent case, ruled against Harvard and the University of North Carolina, stating their use of racial and gender bias is illegal under the 14th Amendment, and thus affirmative action and associated racial essentialism are forbidden. Yet, he says, many of our campuses simply rebrand their offices of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The campus euphemism for using race and gender bias in applications, hiring, retention, and promotion, with newer, as he said, Orwellian names like the Office of Belonging or Community Outreach, and points out that it's illegal to segregate university events or facilities by race, but again, the university sidestepped that by offering race-based graduation ceremonies as auxiliary or additional events and commemorations. Racially segregated dorms are deemed theme houses open to all but de facto widely known as racially inclusive, and points out, of course, if you ever wanted to have an extra white graduation, the university would shut that down and even maybe talk about expelling the students. So again, it goes in just one direction. So up until now, he's given us at least 3 very good reasons why maybe universities would not really want to fight the federal government, which is why if you start reading between the lines, overtly, the Harvard president saying, we're not going to capitulate. Covertly, they seem to be hiring some individuals that have been favorable to the Trump administration, maybe with a back door to try to work out some kind of settlement. When we come back, let me pick out a few more, because we've mentioned just a few of the reasons why these universities might not want to fight the federal government, but Victor Davis Hanson isn't finished, nor are we. Just as we go to a break, though, let me just mention again that we do have our Take Action item. And if you haven't taken action, let me encourage you to do so. It's very simple. You can click on that button that says Take Action. You can read about the so-called SAFE Act. The SAFE Act has already passed the House. It's now in the Senate. If you want to contact your 2 United States senators, we make it easy for you to do so. So simply go to the website, pointofview.net. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation about Victor Davis Hanson's piece. We'll be right back.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we've been talking about what Victor Davis Hanson puts together are do elite universities really want to fight the government? He's talked about the rising cost of higher education, the lack of any kind of intellectual diversity on campus, and even the legal issues that have been surfaced because of the Supreme Court ruling against Harvard and the University of North Carolina. Here are three more. Another one that he focuses on is what you might call foreign influence. Over the past few decades, he writes, foreign governments without audit have poured some $60 billion in America's purportedly most prestigious universities. That would be communist China and illiberal Qatar have alone given $500 million just last year alone. And he says they expect and receive something for their ideologically driven sentiments. The Department of Education, during the first time in which Donald Trump was president, fined many campuses millions of dollars for not reporting these quid pro quo gifts. And you have to wonder again why we are dealing with a number of foreign students from these dictatorial and, in many cases, anti-American nations, China, some of the Middle Eastern autocracies, and what that has done to create a growing anti-American, even anti-Israel protest. And so this foreign influence is another issue that he raises. Two more that come to mind. No protection. Now, on the one hand, the Bill of Rights and its later amendments apply to everyone in everywhere in the United States. So it doesn't matter whether you're a student or a non-student, doesn't matter whether you're a citizen or not citizen. But these laws are especially operative on those entities that receive federal government funding. And if they don't obey that, then certainly they would forfeit some of their, what he calls, operational autonomy. Yet he points out, and you know this well because we've talked about this on the program many times before, he says disruptions of invited guests who are conservative or pro-Israel or pro-life, or who even question the idea of biological males competing in female sports, are commonplace on campus. Anytime you take any one of those positions, many times they take all of those positions, and you're thinking about, whether it's Ben Shapiro or a variety of others, or whether it's the issue of biological males competing with female sports, whether or not some of those individuals have been attacked. And he says usually when an invited conservative federal judge or a Republican office holder or a traditional activist or professor deemed not conservative enough is shouted down, or the lecture hall is swarmed with disruptive and sometimes violent student protesters, campus administrators issue maybe a pro forma stern statement about not tolerating violations of free speech, but then they do nothing. He says most campus officials either empathize with the spirit or the ideology of the disruptors, or they are far more afraid of their own radical professors and students than they are of federal government cutting off their funding for refusing to guarantee First Amendment protections. So again, this whole idea of First Amendment could be either a carrot or a stick. But nevertheless, that's the case. He goes on to say that most campus administrators assume that if conservative pro-life students ever swarmed a pro-abortion lecturer, or if Jewish students ransacked a Middle East studies classroom or chased and then trapped foreign students in a library, they would be expelled. You know that would be the case. Most naturally assume that universities' selective timidity and laxity are ideologically and politically driven. He says there's also no guarantee of due process on campus under the Bill of Rights, points out some of these hot-button crimes and the rest. But let me go on to the last one. If these other 5 illustrations are not enough, the last one should cause concern because we've also lowered our standards. He says the best-kept secret of our marquee universities is a radical fall-off in standards as once defined by their once ballyhooed tough requirements. Our best universities customarily now ensure that 70 to 80% of students in their classes receive what? An A grade. Prestigious campuses like Harvard and Stanford have recently introduced remedial math classes. Privately, they supposedly are more demanding campuses, know that their prior non-meritocratic, admissions have resulted in thousands of students who enter college without the high school preparation necessary to meet their own past university requirements. When pressed, universities usually point to their professional and graduate schools in medicine, engineering, math, science, and business as integral to American prosperity. True they are, but to the degree they are, it's likely because they've either resisted university orthodoxy or were never politicized as the social sciences and humanities have been as well. He says if the universities were smart, they would accept federal conditions to follow the law and protect the safety and interests of their own students. That way, they would restore their academic rigor and reputations, regain public support, and enhance meritocracy, the key to their former excellence. A very good piece. By the way, I've still left out some of what he writes about there, and if you'd like to read it, it is our second article, Do Elite Universities Really Wish to Fight the Government? But just before we take a break, what about this idea of tax-exempt status? And John Yu, who is a professor at the University of California at Berkeley, an individual that has also been a senior fellow. I guess his co-author has been a senior fellow there as well. John Yu, I should clarify, used to be also at the University of California, Berkeley, but also at the Civitas Institute at the University of Texas at Austin, but also his co-author is an individual that is a fellow with the American Enterprise Institute. But they make the case that it is quite possible that Harvard University could lose its tax-exempt status, and that was a surprise to me. And the reason is he goes back to a 1983 Supreme Court opinion. That is one I'm familiar with. One of the first newspaper columns I ever wrote that appeared in the Dallas Morning News was about the decision by the IRS to pull the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University. The campus at the time prohibited interracial dating. Since then, they've removed that. But at the time, that was justification enough to actually remove the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University. And the argument that John Yu and his co-author make is that if you are going to go against Harvard University and remove its tax-exempt status, the Supreme Court created the precedent in 1983 for doing that because the argument was you have violated some of the discriminatory policies that are part of federal law. The Supreme Court has already ruled that Harvard University has indeed violated the policies of the federal government and the Constitution with their admission policies. The administration, he says, could further argue that Harvard's failure to protect Jewish students from harassment violates their public policy against racial discrimination. And so you have some of those examples which were very easily on view after October 7th a year ago with the invasion in Israel of Hamas. And then the Harvard defenders might respond, well, yes, but the three branches of government have not presented the same united front on affirmative action as existed in the Bob Jones case. But then the court could go back to some of their other cases, the Bakke case, of course, this one with the issue of affirmative action and a number, and that is the case. And so they conclude, the authors conclude that Harvard could run into a brick wall. That would be the court itself. And if Harvard then takes its case to the Supreme Court, the Trump administration could ask the court to expand Bob Jones. It will argue that the agreement of the other branches on public policy is unnecessary, and only the court's view that racism violates public policy matters, and argue on that case. And so, again, the Harvard defense could be arguing that, well, we have academic freedom and our contributions to science and medicine. But if you go back to the 1983 case of Bob Jones, the court ignored the teaching and research benefits of the university and rejected that claim, and illustrates again that if indeed that 1983 decision against Bob Jones was expanded, Harvard University could lose its tax-exempt status. Of course, we certainly could also point out the possible danger to Christian institutions, universities, hospitals, and others. But it is an interesting case, and it's our next article that you can read if you'd like to read it in its entirety about the loss of a tax-exempt status for Harvard University. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me ask a question. What is dark woke? Okay, you probably are going to hear this for the first time, although it's interesting, even though I posted this article yesterday for us to talk about today, I noticed last night there were some individuals talking about it, in part because Jack Crosby wrote about it in New York Times. By the way, this article and the one we'll probably not get to today are not necessarily by a people that we would agree with or would agree with some of the things that we talk about here on Point of View, but I always like to go to the source, and this source is the New York Times. Jack Crosby writes this piece for the New York Times. He's also written quite a bit for Rolling Stone and others. And again, you can take it for what it's worth, but they're now starting to talk about online dark woke. What are we talking about here? I'll spend some time with this. We may get back to some of it tomorrow because it also relates to the other piece that I think we will postpone to tomorrow, the new Democratic divide, because you are starting to see Democrats trying to say, okay, what are we going to do? Who's going to be our standard bearer? Who's going to be our leader? Who's going to run even in the midterms in less than 2 years? Who's going to run for the presidency in less than 4 years? A lot of issues. But part of it is a change in strategy. Jack Crosby puts it this way. There was a time last summer when the Democratic Party was cool. Kamala Harris had just stepped in as the Democratic Party's nominee for president in the waning days of summer. She went on the popular podcast Call Her Daddy. Tim Walz's outdoorsy drip led to a camo trucker hat. The memes were flowing. The party's mood was high. But that point, he says, that moment has passed. And now, of course, Donald Trump is in the White House. Republicans control both the House and the Senate. And except with a couple of Supreme Court decisions, some of the decisions seem to be coming in the direction of some of the things we talk about around the program. So by the time you get to his fourth paragraph, he says, well, as liberals try to get their groove back, some party insiders say Democratic politicians have been encouraged to embrace a new form of combative rhetoric aimed at winning back voters who have responded to President Trump's, and of course he says, no-holds-bar version of politics. It's an attempt to step outside the bounds of political correctness and to be crass but discerning, rude but only to a point, and online this has the name dark woke. The argument is pretty simple. It's a meme, he says, that lives mostly online, but its roots have been sown throughout the party for years. He says in the waning days of the Biden administration, memes about Dark Brandon often referred to the version of the former president that conservatives most feared. That's his perspective. Not sure about that, but okay, we'll leave it there. And that is the idea that we're just going to be a lot more in your face, a lot more intense. And the best example of that comes from this meeting a year ago, interestingly enough. It's amazing that happened a year ago. It was last May, and here we are in April, in which in the House Oversight Committee, there was a dust-up between then not that well-known Representative Jasmine Crockett and, of course, fairly well-known Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. And Marjorie Taylor Greene talked about Jasmine Crockett's fake eyelashes, which then caused a appeal to the head of that committee, which is James Comer, a Republican from Kentucky. And, of course, Jasmine Crockett said, wait a minute, Mr. Chair, a point of order. I'm just curious, just to better understand your ruling. If somebody on this committee then starts talking about somebody's bleach, blonde, bad-built butch body, that would not be engaging in personalities, correct? Because she was then chiming back at, of course, Marjorie Taylor Greene. Well, that particular moment became a meme, probably gave a lot of national visibility to Jasmine Crockett, was printed on a T-shirt, and it got an appearance on Jimmy Kimmel. So you can kind of see that that was, if you want to have the coming out party of woke, which we'll call it dark woke, was there. And so, again, the credo, as, again, Jack Crosby points out, for the Democrats, goes all the way back to Michelle Obama, who in 2016 said, when they go low, we go high. And now, he says, some Democrats want to see how low they can go, too. And so the implication is Donald Trump and Republicans have been saying nasty things. By the way, I don't disagree with that. We've talked about the lack of civility for some time. But then you, of course, are starting to see more examples of dark woke. Jasmine Crockett, certainly one that is engaged in that. We talked about, of course, her reaction to Marjorie Taylor Greene. How about referring to the governor of the state of Texas, Greg Abbott, who's in a wheelchair, as Governor Hot Wheels, and you're seeing a lot more there. And at the same time, there has been a desire on the part of Tim Walz, You remember him. He was running as the vice presidential nominee to actually go out and say a lot more crass things. And the other day, Tim Walz was saying, for example, when he was in Ohio, I know I'm going to get something right when the Fox News crowd is just, well, he's using some words I won't use, at me like crazy. I'm loving it. Elon Musk was crying, Tim is being mean to me. And so now you're starting to see a little bit more of the emphasis of what people are starting to call dark woke. I'll give you a preview to our other piece, and that is talking about the new Democratic divide, because it is a divide not only on strategy, but it's also maybe a divide on generational, because some of the younger individuals in the Democratic Party, and I'm thinking of David Hogg, who is right now the vice president of the vice chair, I should say, of the Democratic National Party, is talking about being a lot more in your face. And so I think you're going to start seeing that there is going to be not only more evidence of the so-called dark woke rhetoric, but also of a generational difference where maybe the younger are more likely to do so. Not to say that certainly Nancy Pelosi has not engaged in what could be called dark woke, or Chuck Schumer or a few others that are much older. But I think as we get into some of this tomorrow, a real kind of searching for who's the leader, what is the strategy, who are going to be the individuals that are going to be front and center in the Democratic Party, and how to maybe address some of these issues. And those issues run from, of course, DOGE to deportation to tariffs, what I call the DDT, that are point and center of some of the controversy. And even within the party, a disagreement about whether or not we should be for tariffs or against tariffs, a real division there as well. So we'll certainly get into that in the future, but it's just a good reminder, an illustration of how much has really changed simply since the election of Donald Trump, how in some respects his tweets have changed things as well, and how that may not bode well for any hope for civility in any kind of political discourse in the future. But we'll cover some of that probably tomorrow. Let's, if we can, also mention that yesterday my commentary was on tariff facts. Even if we can't agree about the good or bad of tariffs, I think we can at least agree with some of the basic facts that I set forth. And while we're talking about a culture, we've sort of moved, as is evidenced by this research done by NCRI and Rutgers University, from a maybe cancel culture to an assassination culture, which again comes part and parcel with some of the things we've talked about here on Point of View. So I hope you'll join us tomorrow. First hour, we're going to talk about just because you graduate from high school doesn't mean you have to graduate from God. And we'll talk about that then. Most importantly, I want to thank Megan for her help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.